Look at a modern highway map of northeastern Oklahoma near the Kansas border. Trace the grid of state roads and you'll find an empty void in Ottawa County. No exit signs, no green municipal borders. Drive down into it, and the asphalt cracks and fades into overgrown fields, hollowed out foundations, and gray hills that look like a lunar landscape. This is Picher. Today, it's a ghost town erased from state records. A century ago, it was the center of the global lead in zinc industry. During the 1920s, Picher was the wealthiest mining boomtown in the U.S., the ore capital of the world. 15,000 people packed into a grid of brick storefronts, theaters, and neighborhoods. Streetcars hummed. Luxury hotels hosted executives from New York and Chicago. Men pulled massive wages out of the dirt and cash flowed. If you want to know how industrial empires rise and how the physical consequences of their ambitions eventually erase them, subscribe. I document the architectural ghosts and corporate decisions that scar the American map, from peak prosperity to total collapse. Picher was built on two metals, lead and zinc. In 1913, prospectors sinking test shafts into the prairie struck ore. It was part of the Tri-State Mining District, a geological gold mine spanning Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri. But the concentration directly beneath Picher was different. It was massive. When World War I broke out the next year, global demand for these metals exploded. The military needed lead for ammunition and artillery, and zinc for brass. Picher grew overnight. By the time the U.S. entered the war, miners in this single Oklahoma town were pulling out an unbelievable amount of rock. Throughout both world wars, the Picher field produced over half the lead and zinc used in American ammunition. The town armed the nation. Wartime demand didn't just end, it transitioned. The 1920s consumer economy ran on these metals. Cars needed lead for batteries and zinc for tires. The housing boom needed lead for pipes and paint. Picher fed the entire machine. The era of the scrappy prospector didn't last. Dozens of mining operations consolidated into the Tri-State Zinc and Lead Ore Producers Association. This group became the de facto government. They dictated wages, controlled production, and lobbied lawmakers to kill off regulations. The association brought assembly line efficiency to dirt. They used room and pillar mining. Miners descended hundreds of feet in metal cages, blasting caverns out of the rock. They left massive limestone pillars to hold up the ceiling. Over the decades, they carved out hundreds of miles of tunnels, pulling millions of tons of material directly from under the town. The raw rock coming out of the ground wasn't pure metal. It was mostly limestone, dolomite, and silica, with a tiny fraction of usable ore. To separate it, above-ground mills crushed the boulders into gravel. They used water and gravity to extract the heavy lead and zinc particles. The corporations kept the 2 or 3% of the material that was profitable. The remaining 97% was pure waste. This crushed, rejected rock was known locally as chat. For corporate accountants, chat was a liability. The volume of daily waste was huge. Hauling millions of tons of crushed rock miles away required trains and trucks, which ate into margins. The executives demanded a cheaper solution. Their answer was simple: don't move it, just leave it. With no zoning laws or environmental regulations in the Tri-State District, the companies built conveyor belts extending straight out of the mills. They ran 24 hours a day, dumping crushed rock directly onto the ground. Man-made mountains began to rise across Picher. These conical piles of pale gravel grew to 300 feet tall. Because the ore was directly under the town, the mills were built right in the residential grid. Chat piles were dumped next to houses, businesses, and schools. A 50-story mountain of industrial waste would loom over a backyard property line, creeping closer to the foundation with every shift. Residents accepted this as the reality of a boomtown. On windy days, gray dust blew off the piles. It coated brick storefronts and drifted into living rooms. Locals called it the smell of money. As long as the mills crushed rock, the town was wealthy. 15,000 people built a rich community in the shadow of their own industrial waste. But the waste wasn't harmless. Milling technology in the 1920s was imperfect. It couldn't extract all the heavy metals. The millions of tons of chat piling up across Picher were laced with microscopic particles of raw lead, zinc, and cadmium. This was a massive, unregulated repository of toxic heavy metals, baking in the sun and blowing through the streets. Lead is a potent neurotoxin. It doesn't degrade. Once it's pulled from the earth and pulverized into dust, it stays dangerous. To the executives of the Tri-State Association, The chemical composition of the chat was irrelevant. The material was a sunk cost, written off their ledgers. They had optimized extraction and eliminated waste disposal costs, securing record dividends. The executives counted their profits from boardrooms hundreds of miles away. Back in Picher, the gray mountains multiplied, casting long shadows over the local elementary school, and the town was rich and entirely dependent on the mills. But the very dust blowing through the streets, the dust locals called the smell of money, was quietly poisoning them. By the mid-20th century, the earth beneath Ottawa County had yielded over $1 billion in raw ore. Shipped out on endless freight trains, the haul was worth tens of billions today. You wouldn't see that wealth deposited in local banks or manicured municipal parks. You'd see it casting long shadows over the rooftops, mining $1 billion in lead and zinc left behind a landscape that simply didn't belong in nature. 30 perfectly conical mountains of crushed rock dominated the skyline. Some stretched over 300 feet high, massive pale gray monoliths of industrial waste boxing in the city limits. The milling operations were generating chat faster than the unused land could hold it. The piles were actively choking the municipal grid. The mining conglomerates had a problem. They needed space to dump the ongoing byproduct of their mills, but paying commercial trucks to haul millions of tons of heavy gravel out of the county would cut into the profit margins expected back in Chicago and New York. They needed the footprint cleared, and they needed someone to move the rock for free. The solution was a quietly devastating PR maneuver. They didn't just ignore the waste, they rebranded it. It was a masterclass in shifting corporate liability onto the public. The mining companies told city planners and county commissioners that this endless supply of crushed rock was no longer an industrial byproduct. It was a civic gift, a durable, easily accessible, completely free construction aggregate. Desperate to stretch tight budgets in a boomtown, local officials accepted the offer without hesitation. Why pay commercial quarries for paving materials when mountains of free gravel sat at the end of every street? Fleets of municipal dump trucks loaded up thousands of tons of the pale gray chat and spread it across the county. The local government used it to grade miles of new roads. They mixed it into asphalt and used it as foundational fill for concrete sidewalks and basements. The mining companies even encouraged private citizens to back their pickup trucks right up to the mills. Residents shoveled the free chat to fill potholes in their driveways or landscape their backyards. It was abundant, it packed down densely, and it saved everyone money. But the worst of it ended up in spaces built specifically for the community's children. The school board authorized hundreds of tons of the crushed rock to line the high school track field. High school athletes ran daily laps, their heavy metal cleats digging deep into the gravel. With every stride, they kicked up a fine mist of heavy metals into the humid summer air, breathing deeply as they crossed the finish line. The Parks Department spread thick layers of the material beneath swing sets and slides at local playgrounds. Parents hauled wheelbarrows full of the fine, sandy dust into their backyards, dumping it directly into wooden sandboxes. An entire generation of children in Picher built castles and spent their afternoons in a sandbox of pure industrial waste. The corporate experts knew the risks. The severe neurological impacts of lead exposure were well established in medical and scientific circles by the mid-20th century. Yet official company literature maintained a strict narrative. The chat was perfectly inert. Clean, safe. The executives prioritized a frictionless, zero-cost disposal method over public health. By weaving the mining waste directly into the daily infrastructure of the town, the conglomerates outsourced their environmental liability to 15,000 unwitting residents. The city paved its own streets with poison. For years, the arrangement held. As long as the mills crushed rock and the paychecks cleared, residents accepted the gray dust coating their cars and tracking into their living rooms. But extraction economies share one inescapable reality. The earth is finite. By the early 1960s, the massive subterranean ore body that birthed the town was running dry. Decades of relentless 24-hour excavation had hollowed out the earth. The easily accessible high-grade veins were gone. Miners were forced to blast deeper into the bedrock, chasing thinner, lower-quality seams of metal just as global post-war demand began to cool, driving down the price of zinc. The cost of running massive underground pumps to keep the deep shafts dry began to outweigh the market value of the rock being hauled to the surface. The ledgers turned red. The mining conglomerates didn't bother with a slow-managed transition for the local economy. They just pulled the plug. In the late 1960s, the major operators ceased all production in Picher. The massive conveyor belts that had run continuously for half a century stopped. Companies dismantled the valuable milling equipment, loaded their heavy machinery onto outbound freight trains, and locked the administrative offices. They packed up the profits, and they left. Without federal environmental cleanup laws on the books, there was no legal mechanism forcing the companies to restore the landscape. They simply walked away from the industrial leases. The corporate entities dissolved, merged, or relocated to richer deposits in other states. They left the towering mountains of Chat standing exactly where they were. They left miles of roads paved with heavy metals. They left the playgrounds coated in lead dust. And beneath the surface, they left hundreds of miles of empty subterranean caverns. The immediate crisis was highly visible. The primary economic engine of the town was gone. Main Street storefronts boarded up. Streetcars stopped running. Families who had relied on mining wages for 3 generations suddenly found themselves without an income, triggering a slow, painful exodus. But the worst damage wasn't economic. The wind kept blowing toxic dust off the abandoned mountains. Toddlers kept digging in tainted sandboxes. Runners kept kicking up gravel on the track field. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, a strange pattern emerged in the waiting rooms of local health clinics. A slow, undeniable wave of severe developmental delays, behavioral disorders, and inexplicable chronic ailments began creeping through the elementary school classrooms. The multi-million-dollar corporations were long gone, the wealth thoroughly extracted from the region. No one was left to foot the bill when an entire generation of Picher's children started failing to thrive. By the 1970s, Ottawa County's mechanical roar had died down to an unsettling quiet. Main Street, once a dense grid of brick storefronts and crowded streetcars, was peeling and locked up. The post-industrial slump had set in, and the families who stayed were navigating a town completely stripped of its economy. But the real problem was underneath the pavement. For half a century, mining operations had hollowed out millions of cubic yards of solid bedrock. The town above, every brick building, asphalt road, and residential foundation, rested on limestone pillars left behind in the dark. Those pillars weren't built to hold up a town forever. They were a temporary calculation, left standing just long enough for miners to scrape out the ore around them. Without active maintenance or water pumps, gravity took over. When a subterranean pillar fails, it doesn't happen slowly. 300 feet underground, a single column of rock would shatter under millions of tons of pressure, instantly transferring that geological load to the next pillar. That triggered a violent domino effect in the dark. The cavern ceiling would cave in, tearing upward through layers of bedrock and soil. Up on the surface, the ground simply opened up. These weren't potholes or settling foundations. These were gaping craters, some measuring hundreds of feet across and dropping nearly 100 feet straight down into the black. People would feel an aggressive vibration rolling through their floorboards, step onto the back porch, and find their entire backyard gone. Neighbors' fence, garage, utility poles, swallowed by a jagged abyss of exposed limestone. Sections of the local state highway cracked and dropped into the earth without warning. The highway department couldn't just fill the holes. Dump trucks unloading dirt into a crater connected to hundreds of miles of empty tunnels were just throwing cargo into the void. State engineers had to keep rerouting traffic, redrawing the map around the expanding craters as the county's ground became entirely unpredictable. Property values plummeted to zero. You can't secure a mortgage, sell a home, or buy insurance when your front lawn might cave in by Friday. The remaining residents were trapped in houses they couldn't sell, living on top of a collapsing void. Back when the mines were running, heavy industrial pumps ran around the clock to keep the tunnels dry, pulling millions of gallons of groundwater out of the deep shafts. When the mining companies loaded their equipment onto outbound freight trains and locked the gates, they shut those pumps off. The natural water table immediately started reclaiming the hollowed-out earth. For over a decade, groundwater seeped back into the empty caverns, filling the deepest levels first and creeping upward. If this were just spring water, the flooding might have helped stabilize the ground, but the exposed rock walls were packed with pyrite. Combine exposed pyrite, oxygen, and groundwater, and you trigger a continuous chemical reaction that produces acid mine drainage. The water in the tunnels turned into a corrosive solvent. Sitting in the dark, it aggressively dissolved the heavy metals left in the blasted rock, leaching raw lead, zinc, cadmium, and arsenic into the floodwaters. Beneath the quiet streets, a toxic subterranean lake was expanding. Driven by hydrostatic pressure, it was climbing toward the surface every single day. In 1979, the water ran out of room. Hitting the surface layer, the poisoned water bubbled up through hundreds of abandoned mine shafts and rusted exploration pipes scattered across the county. It breached the surface and poured straight into Tar Creek, the area's primary waterway. Look at photography from the late 1970s. The creek wasn't just muddy, it had turned a thick, unnatural neon orange. The iron in the acidic water oxidized as soon as it hit the air, creating a dense, rust-colored sludge that coated the riverbed and the banks. It wiped out Tar Creek's natural ecosystem. The fish died off, and the waterfowl vanished. That orange water carried dissolved lead and cadmium straight through residential backyards, flowing under highway bridges and past the local schools. It smelled like sulfur and metal. During heavy Oklahoma spring rains, the creek would flood, pushing this heavy metal sludge over the banks and into neighborhoods and farm fields. When the floodwaters receded, they left a permanent toxic orange stain on tree trunks and concrete foundations. At the same time, the subterranean chemical reaction ruined the town's shallow water wells. Tap water ran with a harsh, bitter tang. The environment was physically expelling a century of industrial waste right back into the lives of the people left behind. Yet, despite a neon orange river cutting through the county and craters swallowing the highway, the official government response was practically non-existent. State and federal regulators viewed the crumbling town as an isolated casualty of a bygone era. Navigating the legal liability for long-dissolved corporate entities was an administrative headache no agency wanted to touch. The mining conglomerates hadn't technically broken any environmental laws during their peak operations, simply because those laws didn't exist yet. The companies were gone, and the wealth was gone. There was no deep pocket left to fund a cleanup. For years, the town was just left to sink. The remaining population was trapped. They had no money to relocate, and the local government lacked the tax revenue to patch the roads, let alone purify a poisoned aquifer. But the disappearing highways and the neon orange creek were just the visible damage. The real devastation was happening out of sight. As the ground fractured and the water ran orange, heavy metals were actively accumulating in the bloodstreams of the town's children. As Picher limped into the 1990s, the worst damage wasn't environmental, it was biological. School and medical records from the era show a steep rise in severe learning disabilities. Test scores plummeted. Pediatricians documented developmental plateaus and chronic behavioral disorders. An entire generation of children was missing basic cognitive milestones. Decades of heavy metal dust blowing through the streets, toxic gravel packed into the high school track, and contaminated sand boxes were taking their toll. The EPA eventually stepped in, designating the area the Tar Creek Superfund site. Government epidemiologists set up clinics and started drawing blood from the town's youth. The results were grim. Over a third of the children in Picher tested well above the extreme danger threshold for lead. The numbers weren't just elevated, this was a community-wide crisis. Lead is a neurotoxin that mimics calcium. When a child inhales microscopic dust, the body absorbs it into the bloodstream where it crosses the blood-brain barrier. Once inside the central nervous system, it wrecks neural development. It damages the prefrontal cortex, impairing impulse control, emotional regulation, and executive function. The damage doesn't heal with time. It is a permanent alteration of a child's cognitive potential. Mining conglomerates had prioritized cheap waste disposal, and the town's children paid the price with their central nervous systems. With the medical data undeniable, the federal government had to act. But finding someone to foot the bill was a dead end. The original mining empires were long gone. Decades of corporate mergers, strategic bankruptcies, and dissolved charters shielded the wealthy stakeholders from financial responsibility. There was no deep corporate pocket left to tap. The cleanup bill fell to the taxpayer. The scope of Tar Creek was massive. Millions of tons of heavy metal waste towering over the town, hundreds of miles of collapsing tunnels, and a poisoned aquifer. Faced with an astronomical price tag to actually fix the landscape, politicians balked. Bureaucratic infighting and a lack of political will stalled a real solution. Instead of relocating the town or restoring the environment, the government opted for a half measure. They applied a standard residential fix to an industrial wasteland. The EPA initiated a yard remediation program. Crews and heavy protective gear arrived in Picher with fleets of earth movers. They cordoned off individual properties and scraped the top 6 to 18 inches of contaminated soil off the lawns. Once the poisoned dirt was hauled away, they rolled out a bright orange plastic mesh barrier over the ground, a permanent warning that the soil beneath remained toxic. Finally, the crews dumped clean topsoil over the mesh and laid out brand new green sod. On the surface, the residential blocks looked better. The government had spent millions landscaping the yards of an impoverished post-industrial town. But just past the freshly watered grass, the 300-foot-tall mountains of toxic chat were still standing exactly where the mining companies left them. The federal budget didn't include money to move the millions of tons of crushed rock dominating the skyline. They were deemed too big to tackle. It was a multi-million-dollar Band-Aid. Locals watched government crews lay fresh sod and issue clean bills of health, only to look up and see a 50-story monolith of heavy metal dust waiting for the next strong breeze. When the Oklahoma wind swept across the plains, it lifted the fine, pale gray dust off the unprotected piles and blew it right back onto the new grass, the rooftops, and the children's bicycles. The entire remediation effort was pointless. The residents of Picher knew the government's efforts were a joke. The public health data was in the local papers. Parents knew what their kids were breathing. The obvious answer was to pack up, sell the house, and leave. But the local economy trapped them. If you had a steady job in a neighboring county, a modest savings account, and a 3-bedroom home in Picher your family had owned for generations, and you decided it was time to leave, you'd list the house on the market, and 0 buyers would show up. The real estate market inside the Tar Creek Superfund site hit 0. Nobody buys a residential property in a designated toxic zone where the soil requires government excavation. Banks redlined the entire town, refusing to underwrite mortgages. Insurance companies revoked policies, unwilling to cover homes sitting on top of collapsing mine shafts. It was an economic quarantine. You couldn't sell. You couldn't borrow against your equity. You could only stay. Families without the cash to walk away from their mortgages and pay double rent were physically trapped. They had to raise their children in a contaminated zone because they couldn't afford a moving truck and a deposit on an apartment in another state. The wealth extracted from beneath their feet built distant corporate empires, leaving the miners' descendants holding worthless deeds to poison dirt. Local activists and desperate city officials petitioned Washington for a federal buyout program. They argued that if the government couldn't afford to remove the waste, it had a moral obligation to remove the people. But the bureaucracy crawled. Appraisers debated property values. Lawmakers argued over funding. Years dragged into a new decade, and residents remained in limbo, living in the shadow of the chat piles as their town deteriorated. By the early 2000s, Picher was structurally unsound, crippled by poverty, and actively poisoning its own youth. The standoff between a stalled government buyout and a trapped population seemed endless, but neither geology nor bureaucracy would deal the final blow to the ore capital of the world. A completely different force was building on the horizon, one so destructive it would finally force the government's hand. On the afternoon of May 10, 2008, the sky over northeastern Oklahoma turned a bruised, unnatural shade of purple. A massive low-pressure system had stalled across the Central Plains, dragging humid air straight up from the Gulf of Mexico. The wind died. The barometric pressure plummeted. Then the siren started. Just outside the city limits, a wall cloud dropped from the supercell and tightened into an EF4 tornado. This wasn't a quick touchdown. It was a multi-vortex funnel-packing winds well over 200 miles per hour, carving a mile-wide trench straight toward town. The storm didn't just graze the outskirts of Picher. Radar from that day shows the tornado bisecting the town. But as the funnel tore into the southern edge of the city, it hit something you won't find in any standard tornado alley. The winds slammed directly into the 300-foot-tall mountains of industrial waste that boxed in the neighborhoods. The intense updraft acted like a vacuum. It sucked thousands of tons of pale gray chat, heavy with raw lead and zinc, straight off the piles and aerosolized the metal dust. The tornado turned into a toxic, abrasive cloud. It sandblasted everything in its path. Entire rows of historic brick buildings were stripped to their foundations. Over 150 homes were instantly leveled, their splintered frames scattered across the collapsing mine shafts. 6 people died in the wreckage, and dozens more were badly injured. When the storm passed, survivors climbed out of their cellars into an unrecognizable town. Responders from neighboring counties rushed in, only to hit a wall. The tornado had ripped the asphalt right off the state highways and flooded the sinkholes. Heavy rescue vehicles couldn't get through. Everything, shattered timber, twisted power lines. The ground itself was coated in a thick gray sludge. Years prior, a multi-million-dollar government program had painstakingly scraped contaminated topsoil from residential lawns. In less than 3 minutes, the storm erased all of it. Winds ripped the fresh green sod straight out of the earth. The bright orange warning mesh was shredded and blown miles into adjacent farmland. Torrential rains washed thousands of gallons of acidic, heavy metal surface water right through the shattered living rooms of leveled homes. The temporary bandage was gone. The toxic nerve of the landscape was exposed all over again. Normally, the morning after a natural disaster follows a predictable script. Governors tour the wreckage. FEMA sets up command centers. Politicians stand in front of news cameras, point at the rubble, and promise residents they'll rebuild the community stronger than ever. In Picher, none of that happened. Instead of deploying construction crews, state and federal authorities saw a cold, pragmatic opportunity. The storm had just broken a decade of bureaucratic gridlock. For the government, this was the ultimate exit strategy. Rebuilding a municipal water system over collapsing mine shafts was an engineering nightmare. Constructing new homes inside an actively failing Superfund site was a massive public health liability. The devastation gave them the perfect excuse to execute a hard stop on the town's existence. The state issued a mandate. Rebuilding was strictly prohibited. No new building permits. No federal grants to repair the electrical grid. The government used the disaster to wash its hands of an unfixable environmental mess. The long-stalled federal buyout program that local activists had begged for was suddenly unlocked and put on fast forward. This wasn't a generous relocation package. It was a forced liquidation. Appraisers descended on the wreckage. But how do you appraise a home that was already economically redlined, sitting in a toxic quarantine zone, and now reduced to a shattered concrete slab? The government's offers stuck strictly to property values that had been crashing for decades. Families who had poured generations of equity into their homes were handed pennies on the dollar. It was barely enough for a down payment in a neighboring uncontaminated county. People took the buyouts because there was no alternative. You can't stay in a town where the utility companies have been ordered to permanently sever the main supply lines. The exodus began immediately. Through the rest of 2008 and into 2009, Picher was systematically dismantled. Moving trucks formed long convoys heading out of town. Demolition crews arrived to level the remaining structures so no one would try to squat in the ruins. They bulldozed the debris into gaping basements and capped them with dirt. The local economy evaporated overnight. The last few businesses on Main Street boarded up their windows for good. A city requires a population and a tax base to legally exist. With the residents forced out and tax revenue dropping to zero, the town's mechanics fell apart. The Postal Service closed the local branch and revoked Picher's zip code. The police department disbanded, handing authority over to the county sheriff. In May 2009, the high school held one last graduation ceremony for a handful of seniors. The students walked across a makeshift stage to receive their diplomas, fully aware they were the final class in the town's history. Shortly after, the state dissolved the local school district and reassigned the empty territory. The civic infrastructure was gone. On September 1st, 2009, the state revoked the municipal charter. Picher was legally dissolved. It was wiped off official registries and deleted from highway maintenance maps. The last residents packed up, locked the doors to the few structures left standing, and drove away. State highway crews arrived shortly after, dropping concrete barricades and chain-link fences across the access roads. They bolted reflective warning signs to the asphalt, marking the territory a restricted hazard zone. The roar of the mining engines had died decades ago. Now, the hum of residential life was gone too. Total silence settled over the fractured landscape. The mining conglomerates had extracted their billions and vanished. The government had wiped its hands of the liability, and the residents were scattered across the state. Picher was completely empty. But illegal dissolution doesn't erase millions of tons of heavy metal waste. It doesn't stop a toxic, acidic aquifer from rising to the surface. The barricades were locked and the town was surrendered to the elements. Now, the earth would have to deal with the ruins. Step past the concrete barricades on the state highway, and you walk straight into an empty void. Picher defies how we think American towns work. Cities are supposed to grow, adapt, or at least leave behind a historic district. Not here. This municipal grid was surrendered, and the drop-off from a functioning rural county to an ecological quarantine zone is absolute. On what used to be Main Street, the asphalt is shattered. Without a public works department to seal the roads against the Midwestern freeze-thaw cycle, the pavement just spiders into jagged thermal cracks. Pale, hardy weeds push up through the fractures, breaking apart the center lines. But this isn't nature healing. The prairie isn't reclaiming Picher. The vegetation is stunted, its roots trying to anchor in poisoned dirt. The federal demolition crews were thorough, but they couldn't erase everything. Scattered across overgrown lots are the hollowed-out shells of commercial buildings deemed too hazardous or expensive to tear down. Solitary, windowless brick facades stand alone in tall grass. Concrete bank vaults sit wide open to the rain, stripped of their steel doors by scrappers who picked the town clean years ago. Isolated concrete staircases rise out of the dirt, leading to empty air where porches used to sit. The silence here is heavy. If you stand in the center of the grid, the absence of civilization is a physical sensation. No distant hum of highway traffic, no power lines buzzing overhead. The grid was permanently cut at the county line. No lawnmowers, no sirens. A century ago, this exact spot was deafening. It shook with the continuous roar of heavy freight trains, steam-powered mills, and thousands of miners changing shifts. Today, just the wind sweeping across the flat plains. And when that wind blows, it hits the chat piles. They are still here. The federal government never moved them. The sheer tonnage of crushed, heavy metal-laced rock was too much for the EPA's budget. So the man-made mountains stayed. They stand over 200 feet tall, dominating the skyline and casting shadows across vacant lots, pale gray monoliths rising out of the earth. They don't shrink, they don't degrade. On a dry, breezy afternoon, the wind catches the slopes and lifts a fine veil of toxic dust into the air. It drifts across the empty streets, settling over cracked asphalt and rusted fire hydrants exactly like it did when children lived in the houses below. The contamination didn't stop just because the targets left. The heavy metals are still active. These chat piles aren't just industrial leftovers. They are monuments to the balance sheet. Every ton of gray gravel stacked into the sky is a fraction of a cent saved on corporate waste disposal. It's a physical ledger of externalized liability. This is what it looks like when an industry demands maximum immediate profit with zero long-term accountability. The executives who signed the disposal memos retired in pristine neighborhoods. Their shareholders collected reliable dividends. The wealth was extracted and distributed globally. The physical cost was left in Oklahoma. Beneath your feet, the collapse of the town is an ongoing slow-motion event. The massive limestone pillars left behind in the dark are still failing. Even with no one left to report the property damage, the earth caves in. New sinkholes silently open in overgrown fields. Sections of the abandoned highway buckle and drop into the voids. The ground is constantly shifting, settling under the immense weight of the bedrock. And the water table is broken. The water flowing through Tar Creek is heavily stained. The reaction between exposed iron sulfide in the deep mine shafts, oxygen, and rising groundwater is a continuous loop. Acid mine drainage doesn't care about a government closure mandate. Highly corrosive, poisoned water just keeps seeping upward, breaching old boreholes and bleeding into the watershed. Nature can't heal a contamination this massive on a human timeline. Lead and zinc don't biodegrade. The soil can't filter them out. The landscape is dead. Picher is often dismissed as a freak environmental accident or an unfortunate relic of outdated industrial practices. It wasn't. The destruction of this town was a calculated process. The extraction model functioned exactly as designed. The mining boom relied on a simple premise: the earth is expendable. Hollow out the bedrock, strip the valuable ore, dump the toxic byproduct at zero cost, and legally dissolve the company before the biological consequences hit. It's a highly efficient machine. The only flaw is that human beings actually have to live on the land once the machine moves on, and this land is permanently useless. You can't farm it. The soil is too toxic for crops or livestock. You can't build on it. The ground is structurally unsound and prone to sudden collapse. You can't live on it. The groundwater is acidic. An entire natural ecosystem was liquidated in under 50 years, replaced by a barren hazard zone that will require federal monitoring for centuries. We usually measure the success of an industrial empire in raw output, the tons of steel galvanized, millions of rounds of ammunition manufactured, soaring market caps. But the abandoned grid of Picher is the other side of that ledger. The money generated here built gleaming skyscrapers in distant cities. It funded the expansion of the American century. But the origin point of that wealth was left bankrupt, shattered, and biologically toxic. The erasure of the ore capital of the world strips away the mythology of the rugged American boomtown. It reveals the clinical reality of resource extraction. The shattered asphalt, the neon orange creek, and the towering monuments of toxic dust leave one clear takeaway. The true cost of an empire is rarely paid in dollars. It is paid in the irreversible destruction of the earth and the permanent eviction of the communities built upon it.